All right. All right. As Matthew McConaughey once said. So, all right, we're live here. Give it a second. There we go. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down the security rabbit hole to yet another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. James, I wonder how many times I've said that in the years that we've been doing this.
Over 500, I'm guessing.
I don't know if I said it the same way every time, but I tried to be.
No,
I
that's
tried to
true.
throw in a little spicy sometimes, so get the audience, so they're not listening to the same thing every time. But maybe we'll get you to do the intro, James, next time.
Maybe.
Maybe.
We'll switch it up.
How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm awesome. I'm waiting. I'm waiting on spring. It seems like here in Georgia we've got spring already. Then it drops into the 40s at night, and we've got a little bit of winter tries to come pushing back. But man,
that's
78 degrees today. It's going to be gorgeous. And
that's
of course,
Florida weather, man.
On.
North Florida weather. That's what we get too. We don't ever get a long snap of cold. We get the 70, 40, 70, 40. And fortunately today, I think I looked when you asked before this, and I think it said it was 79. So
nice.
We'll take that. I'd rather be enjoying it out in the 79, but at least it's pretty
here
out
we are
the window.
Podcasting. So on that note, let's introduce this week's guest. Ray, you want to give the wonderful people a little who you are and what you do and where you are?
First off, I'm jealous of both of you. I'm stuck in Southwest Connecticut right now, and it's in the 30s, and I'm freezing, hence the sweater. So this isn't just a look. So I'm Ray Emerly. I'm the Chief Information Risk Officer currently for Pitney Bowes, a global mailing, shipping, financial services company, and all the other things that my marketing people have me say. And I've been doing this security shtick for a pretty long time. And Raph, you and I have known each other for, it's got to be at least
about that time.
so
let's not talk about years, because that's too long.
Yeah, it starts to age us quickly, but I've had a pretty long career in security, and I think we're gonna dive into that a little bit more, so I don't want to spoil the podcast.
Yeah, it's not okay. So I guess where I want to start it with you is the question that's always it always sticks to my mind when I meet somebody that's been doing the CISO job for as long as you have. You've got a rich wealth of experience. You've been in different types of companies. What's the biggest thing that's changed in these past, say, 20-ish years for you?
So I think two pieces of it. One is just the amount of exposure and attention to security in general. So when we started this journey in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I still remember my first experience with the I Love You virus and the hacked by Chinese website takeovers and those kind of things.
Oh man.
That's going back a ways. It was always an IT problem, right? So something happens, it breaks, it's an IT problem, you jump in, you fix it, you move on. But over the course of the last couple of decades, especially with the broad attacks on different critical infrastructure and obviously ransomware and everything that's happened on that front, I think the exposure all the way up to the board level and the appreciation for what we do from a security perspective has grown significantly.
Okay.
And then the other component I would say too is, really the user population in most organizations understand that they have a little bit of a role to play in this. So culturally, I think it's changed some behaviors, not as much as I think we'd like, but that's another critical component, which I think goes back to the level of visibility and exposure.
How much have you seen expectations change, or have they changed since, over the last 20 years from a security group of the CISO? What's the expectation then as opposed to now? Because we always see the accountability. Somebody's got to get their head lopped off for this and that. Has the expectation changed as far as who's responsible for security? Was it more then? Is it more now?
I think the expectation has changed in the sense that it's much more distributed to some degree. So now, I'll speak from personal experience at Pitney Bowes. A lot of the conversations that we have is in combination with the chief innovation officer, the chief information officer, the general auditor who has a role to play, the general counsel. There's a lot of different players involved in security in an organization when you think about three-line defense models, soup to nuts and whatnot. And I think that recognition that it really is a team effort has been something that I'm seeing a lot more recognition of, which means there will always be one or two heads that will probably roll first, but there's others that are being held accountable for components of making sure that the oversight's there, the governance is there, the diligence in there, and whatnot.
All right. On that note, you mentioned the first heads that will roll. Do you think that today? Let's not go back all the way 20 years. Let's not go all the way back to the beginning, because I think things were, as you said, very, very much different. But as the roles have evolved, as the financial industry and some has been kind of pushing, and a lot of the frameworks require to have someone accountable for the state of security. Having accountability is one thing. The place where I always, when I was on the buyer side of the table, on the enterprise side of the table, what always concerned me, and why I think my primary reason for not going into the CISO suite at that point was that lots of accountability, very little control, right? Very little ability to influence the right and the wrong ways. So it in effect felt like you're being held accountable for a college dorm, but you couldn't actually go tell police what they do every moment. So you're like, all right, so don't burn the building down.
I've never heard the CISO role equated to the RA. That's kind of appropriate in many ways.
Yeah.
I still think that exists, honestly. So again, speaking from my personal experience in the organization, like I own the cybersecurity risk for the enterprise, but there's accountable people within different groups that have components of our mitigation plans as we think about our cyber risk. So for ransomware, malware, and hacking, all the controls that go along with that, there's a lot in the IT suite and in the engineering suite that are focused on those, both from a services perspective as well as an infrastructure perspective. And then you start working your way down the chain, and there's other peoples who have a kind of that racy role to play in that. I think the challenge that a lot of CISOs run into and will continue to run into is, in order for that distributed model to work, you have to build relationships and you have to, partner. So you share that accountability and that responsibility. Some of us don't do that very well, honestly. And then the other piece is too, is you have to be able to understand a lot more about your business and organizational context. There used to be a day when you could be a security expert and walk into any organization and just say, I've done this before, I'm going to do this again, and here's my cookie cutter model. The reality is now is you really have to understand that the business you're walking into, right? So financial into industrial into manufacturing into healthcare, they're all very different. Their risk appetites are different. The controls that they're willing to accept are different, and their exposures are different. And I think that's an element of, in order for somebody to be really effective, you have to understand that the business that you're in, the concerns of the stakeholders that are running those business, and then partner together to apply the organizational context to the controls that you want to put in place. And that's still a bit of an uphill challenge for a lot of CISOs, especially early in career, who have come up, especially from technical ranks, because they haven't really done that business side of it, right? And that creates a bit of a challenge. I've gone a little far afield, but you kind of opened a little bit of a door for me, and I'm just pushing myself back.
I thought it was interesting. One thing you called out in that was mitigation plan, which I don't think we hear a lot of people mention, but it's a good way to identify how other people are involved, not just in understanding the issues, but you could come up with, hey, we've got this big issue. Here's our mitigation plan, which requires, the IT group to do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
They don't do that, right? Something happens and it's like, well, listen, we have the plan. We can clearly show where the breakdown occurred. Whether that was accepted of, hey, we know it's going to take 3 years to get this implemented, or, whatever that may be, but at least there was a plan in place. I'd be curious, how many places are doing kind of detailed mitigation plans like that versus everybody just kind of flying by the seat of their pants. And it's like, all right, we got an issue, like throw it in the vulnerability management system and we'll let it flow from there, and there is no direct, we know who's responsible for these different areas.
Well, and that kind of goes back to the evolution of cybersecurity as an enterprise level risk, right? So as you think about where we started, a lot of it, again, IT, innovation, engineering, wherever it was, there was a lot of these things that went into corrective action systems or whatever terminology you want to use. And it becomes this huge repository, sometimes of a lot of technical debt, and then a whole bunch of stuff that, well, eventually we'll get around to solving that. But it rarely tied back strategically to what were the operational impacts, the revenue impacts, and those kind of things of the organization. So I think a lot of organizations that are maturing, if you look at what's happening with the SEC and others for public companies, I think we're going to see an accelerated path to this for those who aren't there yet. is, okay, let's define this as an enterprise level risk with appropriate accountabilities distributed across. Let's identify what those sub risks are that impact our organization greatly. And a lot of that can be derived from things like MITRE or others. You distill that down. And then working through a organized plan of what's in place currently today, what needs to be in place tomorrow, and how do we track that? And how do we make sure that it's complete when it's in place? And what are the timelines and so forth? And there's not a lot of organizations, I think, that are there yet. But I think with what's happening publicly and between the new executive orders that are emerging, the SEC and others, I think a lot of public companies at least are going to have to force their way forward on that track.
Oh yeah, that's it. Trying to figure out which question I want to follow on to next. All right, you said the word risk. How many of our colleagues are finally getting to the point where you think we understand risk well enough to talk about it in the cyberspace?
I think it's improved a lot. I mean, I remember having conversations with Alex Hutton and Jack Jones and others back in the day, and it was just apparent there was a few pockets of people who absolutely understood what risk meant, and then there was a whole bunch of people who just didn't, right? Or you conflate risk with threat, or risk with vulnerability, or whatnot. I think the understanding is becoming more prominent. I think what we hear most now is going to be around third-party risk, because everybody recognizes that's outside of my purview of control. So for me, I recognize that as a risk because I can't influence that too much directly, other than maybe a contract or some sort of gateway. And they understand like the ransomware and malware and hacking. I think as you get into the more nuanced aspects of what can actually impact an enterprise from a security perspective, whether it's insider threat or it's software supply chain or something like that, I think it's a little more tenuous. But I do think our colleagues are picking up on the fact that this is a risk game, right? It's not a control game, it's a risk game at the end of the day. And most of what you're trying to put in place is about mitigating that risk or mitigating the impact of that risk coming to fruition. And I think there's a greater appreciation for that, but it also depends, again, on how you've kind of come up through the cycle, right? A diversity of experiences in an organization with different roles helps you to kind of contextualize that more than if you were just the IR guy who just suddenly became a CISO, or the guy who is the head of the SOC who suddenly he didn't step back fast enough and now he's the CISO. That there's a learning curve.
Funny enough, I think you and I originally got to know each other over when down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast was just kicking off. And I think you recall the conversation was at that time what you just alluded to, which is the CISO better off being a executive that's moved into a security leader, or is this role better served by somebody that's an experienced technologist in the cybers that has grown up into an executive chair? Has your opinion of that changed any?
It hasn't. Now, keep in mind, this isn't only CIFs work in absolutes, right? So there's, go back to the Obi-Wan thing on the piece of it. But I do think that somebody who kind of grows up going through a bunch of different roles in security and kind of understanding those develops into a better security leader overall quickly. That's not to say that somebody else in that other suite can't, right? But if you look at my career trajectory at this point, I started off in desktop support for Prodigy Internet back in the day. We all remember what that was. Moved into system administration, did time in network operations, AppSec dev, worked in fintech. You start combining all these different experiences and you get a pretty good puzzle or a holistic view. The way I look at like the climb to be a security leader, and we often call that a CISO, but it could be a bunch of different terms, is the higher you go up, the more you have to look at the entire board. So when you're just playing, when you're just the pawn on the board, it's kind of easy to see what's around you. It's like, oh, I've got pawns on the side of me. There's a bishop back there. There's some other guy pushing me along. But as you go higher up, you have to understand how the pieces play together. And then you also get a better view of the threat across the table from you as well, and what you're trying to mitigate. And I think that's a perspective that you only gain with a breadth of experience. But that's personal opinion. Mileage may vary.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? Because I think earlier on, a lot of us talked in absolutes. That how to be that word secure. How do we get to a state? And as we started talking about risk management, the concept, at least early on, right, and maybe even as early as 10 years ago, the concept of the fact that there were some risks we weren't going to mitigate, because at least in the beginning, because we assumed that this is beyond, this is my tolerance. This is too far. This is too low. We got to adjust my numbers. And I keep going back to this statement. One of the guys that was a head of a department when I was at GE Consumer Finance for a long time. Jason, would tell us that he'd ask, how much fraud is there in the credit card industry, and everybody looking up numbers, and he'd say, don't bother, because it's exactly as much as the system will allow, right? And I feel like that was a good lesson for me, because the explanation was any more and we put in mitigating factors, any less and we'd reduce our mitigations, because we want to spend some percent of the global fraud, credit card fraud number. Some small percent is acceptable for fraud. Like that long ago back then was in the trillions of dollars, right? In the huge numbers even. And when you look at the fraud number by itself, you're like, holy cow, this thing is huge. How can we let this happen? He's like, oh, let me show you the whole thing. And you recognize that is a sliver of a sliver. And we're not going to do any more, because two more will cost us more money than we're gaining back. So it's interesting that, to tie this back into what we're doing, risk really is that understanding of what is good enough, acceptable, and what is not. And I'm glad to see this industry moving away from the absolutist mindset of it, that risk has to be zero, because it can never be, because that isn't just like can't be you can't allow all the risks, you can't block all the risks, because you end up with an absolutist that's unworkable on each side, right?
Yeah, and I've had a lot of conversations with auditors in the past too about, like, it's not 100%, right? We're not, okay, yes, and even if we're in the 90s, sometimes I'm going to feel fortunate if we even get that high. But I think the other thing that we're seeing this in practice isn't just conceptual, but the more organizations that are now taking focus on what are my critical assets and infrastructure, what are the things that I absolutely, whether it's my Active Directory or it's my cloud environments or whatever is the management plane for that, they're focusing their efforts there, because they know they have limited resources, limited budget, limited tooling, and honestly limited visibility. So where is the biggest bang for my buck? And while we think of that as almost a resource play, it's really a risk play, right? Because you're thinking, what is the worst that can happen at every stage, and where do I need to put my heaviest defenses? And then I can always expand out. But I think we're seeing a lot more organizations do that. And even when we think about deployment of EDR and everything else, in a perfect world, we'd have 100%. But the reality is most organizations probably are somewhere in the 90s. They have assets they don't even know about. They get plugged into their networks all the time. It's asset management is a constant bane of existence for everybody. But I do think, again, those are practical representations of how the industry has evolved. We're not focused so much on those metrics and numbers of how many installs do we have. It's, are they on the right things?
Is there a difference between the perception that inside the organization has? So we talk about this transformation of the CISO and risk within the enterprise of, hey, there's this acceptable level of risk that we're looking to, versus the outside when you talk about kills me to say it, researchers and these other ones, right? That the journalists out there that are finding things and they're like, this is dumb, and I can't believe you had this hole, and you all this stuff. Like, they're completely abstract from this idea that within the organization we have all these other pieces. They're still looking at it as black and white of, hey, you had this flaw, how could you have not fixed this thing? And so you've got these competing ideas that publicly expose of, hey, we're covering it the best we can and we're doing this, and then you got the other side saying you're not taking this seriously, and how could you not do the fundamentals and the basics, which is everything 100%?
It's incredibly frustrating. You see it in two pockets. One is that armchair quarterbacking security researchers and others, and by the way, there's some really great security researchers out there who don't take that approach, but hindsight is always 20/20. And you usually see that after a company has gone through some sort of significant industry event. So you're already down, right? So now you're kicking them while they're down. But the reality is most failures in a security incident are a combination of things over time that have accumulated to this critical point where something happened, right? It's not just one thing. It's not, we didn't patch this vulnerability or we left one server open without MFA. It's a failure at multiple levels that sometimes is built up over a course of several years and a lot of technical debt, and it just came to fruition because somebody else found it. But the other place that it's coming up more often is when you have customers and clients and regulators and others who now are coming back and looking at, okay, what happened? Why did it happen? And why should I trust you again? Now I think in those contexts, it's important for the organization to understand precisely what did happen and what are the things we're going to put in place to improve, to communicate that. But that one's a little bit less of kicking the dog while it's down and more about, well, once it's up again, do I want to invite it back in my home? So it's a slightly different dialogue.
All right. This is the second time you've mentioned technical debt, so I'm gonna draw on that one. Tech debt has always been something that's been fascinating to me because, and I think that's one of the reasons contributing to the short lifespan of security leaders in organizations. You have clearly not fallen victim to that. How do you overcome old technical debt, and how do you not accumulate? So, two-part question: how do you not keep accumulating more? Because it's a challenge either way. But when you on your day one, you walked in there, and I guarantee, I would bet this podcast on the fact that there was some tech debt that you're like, oh boy, we got to get rid of that. And then over some period of time, that has either gone away because it died a natural death, or you've helped it along into the ether. But every day your organization does things that they don't necessarily ask your permission for. And sometimes things you're like, hey, that shouldn't have happened. Okay, it happened. Now what? So two-part question: how do you handle all the old stuff to clear it out, and then how do you keep from making new stuff every day?
So the old stuff, I don't think anybody could say that they've all cleared it out, and some of it is just fortuitous luck, right? But the reality is as organizations change and evolve and new technology comes in, and to your point, things go end of life, a lot of it is just focusing on what can I put in place from a compensating control perspective to allow us to get to that point of it goes away, right? Because especially in any sort of development operation or anything like that, the reality is why you would love for them to go back and clear a lot of those low and medium vulnerabilities, so you can avoid that whole, oh, well, look, 56, of the ransomware vulnerabilities were actually low and medium according to the CVSS scores, and and we didn't fix those. It's what are the other things in place that allow me to kind of be okay with having that debt and maybe chipping away at it over time until it completely just falls off, right? So I'd love to say that we've cleared the backlog, but a lot of it is really more about understanding what are the controls we have that make that a little more appetizable. That's a word, I think. I just created one. But on the other side of the equation, which is about incurring the new debt, that's where you really have to embed that risk conversation and that risk assessment into everything that you do, whether it's implementation of new IT projects or product development efforts or whatever. And we've done a lot using things like CIS control benchmarks, CIS version 8 controls and so forth to start assessing at the onset of new engagements, what are we doing with this? How is it going to be configured? What new debt might we incur? What debt are we going to retire? And that's a way of starting to align the conversation more around engagement, collaboration, and hopefully some guardrails to make sure that you're not adding on to the already increasing pile of debt. And for my current company is 103 years old. There's a lot of debt we are never going to be able to retire. But I feel pretty confident we've got good controls around what's there until the time comes. So
You're on mute, James.
My bad. Sorry about that. How much effort has to be put into looking at the existing backlog to be able to say, this is how this got there now, so we don't continue adding this. Let's bring that into the new implementation things of, we have got certain type of patching or, some issue that's going on with servers. How do we apply that to the new way we do golden images and things like that to say, hey, you know what, to help so we don't keep putting new stuff in here, here's how we have to change how we do XYZ process, so that way we can keep those images up to date and, be able to apply patches in a way that we don't get caught in these same situations.
Well, I think you have to look at the technical debt issues. I think there's twofold. One is some of the debt's been incurred because it was just at that time it was a different line of thinking, whether it was about some of the seriousness of some of the vulnerabilities or the technology play itself or whatever it was. So there's a component of that where kind of the look back isn't as valuable because it was just 5 years ago, we weren't even thinking about this potential threat vector. So why would we have considered it? But to your point on kind of learning from experiences and going forward, looking at your vulnerability management reports, how things are evolving, aging reports, those kind of things, looking for trends. We spend too much time focused on numbers, right? And we want to drive numbers down. But we need to take a step back sometime and understand why do numbers fluctuate? Why do they go higher? Why do they go lower? When do we, and that helps to then start to inform a strategy that enables you to modify things like vulnerabilities. Right. Or if you're seeing an uptick in certain things in your stock from your EDR detection and those kind of things, we look at those as kind of one-off instances, and maybe in aggregate, we'll say, well, we blocked 5 million instances of whatever. But do you really go back and say, okay, is that a precursor to a new threat vector or some hole that we have in our infrastructure, or maybe a behavioral change that we need to inflect? And that analysis on the data is incredibly valuable. Not even we don't do a great job of it, but every organization should take a look at that. Get away from just your KPIs and KRIs of are my numbers going up and down, but really what's driving that. And I think that gets you closer to solving for that future debt issue. So.
I find it interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things I struggled with a long time ago, call it 20 years or so, was that we had processes for IT that, now cloud was supposed to go fix all this, but I'm not sure it has, but where a piece of software or a piece of hardware went into production, and we did our best at the time to get the things that were bad with it down to a level that we could accept. Okay. Mm-hmm. No high level vulnerabilities, a minimum number of mediums, and then whatever else was there. Configurations and all that stuff were set, blah, blah, blah. 6 months goes by. Things appear that nobody changed anything, but new vulnerabilities showed up. We're like, well, okay, but we've not done nothing. How could there be suddenly more new vulnerabilities? That was the hardest thing for me to explain. Do you still have to deal with that today?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even with the best tooling around vulnerability management, configuration management, and everything else, what is secure today in 6 months will very much likely not be secure tomorrow with nobody even touching anything, right? And I do think that one of the things that I've done when we communicate to the board of directors or we communicate with our clients and everything else is we basically don't put certainty into anything that we say. It's like, this is a point in time right now of our security, but recognize that these threats are constantly evolving. 0 days will constantly emerge. This is a very sophisticated climate because it's ever moving, right? And so one of the things that we've tried to do again is, you put in a lot of places around the vulnerability scanning, the configuration, regular automated reporting, so you can tell when these things change. But of course, as soon as they change, you've now incurred that you have to go off and resolve, right? But I do think there's a better understanding of in the industry in general that it is any inspection is a point in time. And that tomorrow there may be a new log4j that, based on its ubiquity, is everywhere and everybody's got to react to it. Or there's going to be some other new threat that happens, or an Azure misconfiguration that exposes a government server and everybody runs off to fix it. Those kind of things. I do think there's a better appreciation for that it's a constant pushing of the rope uphill. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's kind of where I'm that's where my head was.
It has. I mean, yeah, because I think the toughest thing in understanding about security is that we fight against a tide where, even though you've done nothing to a system or an app or whatever it is, its level of risk can go up or down at any given moment based on the environment, based on externalities you have no control over, right? Yep. So if you don't have a good way of talking about what that actually means or why that happens, you can get absolutely hammered at in governance meetings and other things where people are like, well, you didn't tell me about this 6 months ago. Like, well, this wasn't a thing 6 months ago, right? Like, nobody thought Log4j was going to suddenly end the world nearly for us. Like, it's been out there for how many years? Nobody's ever said anything about it, but suddenly a version came out and somebody discovered something, and bam, now everybody's got to get thrown into the action. And suddenly you wake up one morning and you've got, 6,000 applications of tech debt sitting there with Log4j on it. You're like, how do we fix this? Now, who's got the resources? Where does that, I guess the important question is, where does the money come from to go make these fixes? Because it's not going to be security, it's doing the work, right?
Well, and the thing is too, is it also goes back to, as we think about those prioritized security investments that we were talking about earlier, it goes back as well to that layered security approach. So think about companies that had like a web application firewall when Log4j hit versus those who didn't, right? Or those kind of capabilities. And so there's also, there's always going to be a reactive element to the game that we're playing. It will never go away. We are never going to be completely proactive in the security space. It's just not possible. But I think there are things to think about when you think about your security strategy and your security approach and your defense in depth and those kind of things of, well, what are the things that will help me to mitigate that tide as it's coming in, right? So I can at least break a little bit of it and prioritize, my resources appropriately to fix those critical applications. And that was something I think, just to wax on for 1 second. So, the recent presidential order about liability and software and CISOs coming out, and we're going to hold these manufacturers. What we just described is why that is, to me, I think is very aspirational. I think it's a 5 to 10 year model before you even get there. But when you think about how quickly on a dime configuration errors will emerge, vulnerabilities will emerge, and so forth, that feels like somebody who hasn't worked in the space very much saying, oh yeah, we're going to hold everybody accountable for it. Yeah, but what happens when everybody is impacted and who's liable for that? And I think that's a question I'm kind of curious to see how it gets resolved.
Yeah, suddenly one day you wake up and you're liable for 1,000 of your customers' environments. That becomes very difficult. Yeah, I think aspirational is a good way to put it. I'd word it slightly differently, but we're trying to keep it PG. So, what's that?
It's a PG-13 show, so I was using it.
That's right. Yeah. Listen. So let's kind of wrap up question for you. What's the thing that you are looking at the hardest right now from your organization, not specifically your organization, but from organizations that are undergoing, this kind of generational change in how IT functions and where technology comes from and who operates it and how we look at risk? Like, what's the thing that you're probably most scrutinizing right now and advise others to do?
So really 2 areas I'm going to split it. So one has been a heavier focus on data governance and just data in general, because a lot of like the nuggets that we lose in any of these attacks and malware and everything is data driven, right? When we think about applications that get compromised or services that get compromised, it's usually to get the underlying data some way, shape, or form. So understanding how that relates into your organization, what are the controls there? How long have you kept the information that you have? Is it still valuable to your organization? Because it's going to be valuable to somebody. It just may not be valuable to you anymore. That's been one area of focus. And then the other we alluded to earlier is that third-party risk, whether it's software supply chain, it's the MSP environment, because it's constantly under attack now, the managed service providers and so forth. And all those things that are outside of the purview of your bubble and perimeter. Right. So we have so many more SaaS-based applications that are driving our business, infrastructure as a service that's hosting our business, and very limited understanding and visibility into what's happening there. And we used to just say, well, we have an agreement in place and we've got a SOC 2 report, and so we're golden, right? And it's like, no. So what is that diligence along that entire life cycle of that relationship? And what happens when they have an event? And how quickly can you pull the plug and secure those are the 2 areas where I've got the heaviest focus right now. So.
All right. And last and final, what do you want to leave people, your final thoughts on this thing? What do you want to leave folks with as we tune out here?
I think the main thing is a lot of what we talked about. This is a constant journey for everyone, no matter what your career path is going into, a CISO, whether you're year 1 and you're the guy who got elected up to year 20 and 30. We are never going to be in front of that tide that you talked about. We're always going to be reacting it to some component, but try to understand your business, try to understand the different types of controls and things that you can bring together. And most importantly, be a good team player, collaborate, and just work with the people in your organization, because that allyship will help both getting things done, but also when things go wrong.
I feel like I should drop a stop, collaborate, and listen lyric in here, but I'm gonna let that one go. Right? All right, folks. Thanks for joining us. This has been another great episode of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast with our guest, Ray Emerly. And Ray, we wish you lots of luck in your current and future endeavors and hope to see you back here on the podcast again, sir.
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, James, another good one in the books.
Yeah.
We just keep rolling and rolling, baby, into spring and summer and fall and back into winter and back into spring again. So
it's a vicious cycle.
And that's just this week. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. We'll catch you another time, another place. Make sure you catch us on the LinkedIn live streams. Our YouTube page is getting some love. And we do have a LinkedIn page for the podcast itself for you to interact, ask questions if you're one of our guests, and